Is Yuko Ishihara from the University of Copenhagen. She wrote her PhD thesis, which is not published yet, but it's already written under the supervision of Søren Overgaard. And the title is Transcendental Philosophy and Its Transformations, Heidegger and Nishida's Critical Engagements with Transcendental Philosophy in the late 1920s. So we are looking forward to the publication.
Okay, so today I want to talk about Ueda and Nishida on philosophical reflection. I want to start off by stating what I think is the most enigmatic aspect of Nishida's philosophy, namely that philosophical reflection is employed to shed light on the non-reflective experience prior to the subject-object split. And this is the case for Nishida because the basic idea underlying the whole of Nishida's philosophy is that the ground of reality, whether it's termed pure experience or absolute nothingness, is a selfless experience attained not through any kind of reflection, but through the rupture of reflection, hansei no yabure, as Ueda Shizuteru puts it. So if this is the case, then the question arises, how can one philosophically articulate such ground? What is the nature of philosophical reflection for Nishida? Unfortunately, Nishida is not always forthcoming when it comes to the question of philosophical reflection. But Ueda has given an account of reflection and philosophical reflection in the context of interpreting Nishida. He offers two models of reflection, what he calls small short-term reflection, komari no hansei, and big-term reflection, omari no hansei. And according to Ueda, while the former model is prevalent in the Western philosophical tradition, Nishida works with the latter. And I think Ueda's distinction is helpful since it clarifies how Nishida's account of philosophical reflection differs from the more traditional sort. And it also helps us understand how Nishida's account is in fact a radicalized form of it. In fact, I want to propose that it can be understood that Nishida's account of philosophical reflection can be understood as a radicalized form of transcendental reflection. So today's talk is going to have three parts. First, I will introduce the two models of reflection put forward by Ueda. Then I will give you an account of philosophical reflection by Nishida that Ueda offers. And then I will go on to interpret this as a radicalized form of transcendental reflection. So we'll start with Ueda and the two models of reflection. He starts off with the simple experience, the experience of looking at a flower. Now, in the moment of seeing the flower, is there a self? Very briefly put, in the Western philosophical tradition, it has been understood that there is some kind of implicit self in this pre-reflective experience of looking at the flower, whereas the Buddhist tradition has denied it. Now, what's interesting is that instead of attempting to analyze experience and attempting to give an answer to this, Ueda brackets this question to start off with, whether or not there is a self in the pre-reflective experience of looking at the flower. Rather, he begins his analysis with the following rather uncontroversial point, namely that when I reflect on the experience, I become aware of the I that is reflecting on the experience. So upon reflection, we say, I am looking at the flower. Here, the reflective I goes back to our initial experience and interprets it as my experience. Now, Ueda stops here and says, our thinking can take two directions from here. In the first direction, one can understand the whole experience from the perspective of the reflecting I. So according to this view, one interprets the pre-reflective experience of looking at the flower as constituted by the higher order I, without which there would be no experience to begin with. So here, I, the reflective I, is understood as the condition of possibility for our experience. And naturally, Ueda identifies the culmination of this way of thinking with the idea of transcendental subjectivity. So here we have the understanding, no self, no experience. Now, this is a way, according to Ueda, of articulating the I that is allegedly only implicit in pre-reflective experience. But he says that our thinking can take a different direction. Now, this view also acknowledges that upon reflection, the I, the reflective I, constitutes our experience. But rather than going ahead to articulate the pre-reflective self, it proceeds to eliminate it. So instead of interpreting the initial experience of looking at the flower as that which is only possible on the basis of the I, the initial experience is understood as the original experience, the genkeiken, from which the I arises for the first time. So in this view, no self, pure experience. To cite from Ueda, and he cites from the introduction to the inquiry in Nishida, he says, in the moment of seeing a color, hearing a sound, the subject-object frame breaks and one becomes open to the clearing. This is awakening, kaku. So according to this second view, at first there's a selfless presence of the flower. And here flowers should be put in brackets because there is still not yet the subject-object dichotomy. This is called the experience of kaku, of awakening. Then, upon coming back to oneself, one says, I am seeing the flower. So it is here that the subject-object dichotomy arises for the first time. And, importantly, it is here that jikaku, literally self-awakening, arises. And this kind of reflection, namely reflection qua jikaku, is very different from the first kind, since it has understood its non-reflective, selfless origin in the awakening experience. So here we have the small short-term reflection, which is the first model, and the big-term reflection, which is the second model. So in the small short-term reflection, the self comes back to itself very straightforwardly. But on the second model, the self comes back to itself, but it has also understood its selfless origin. So here, Ueda calls it the big-term reflection. It has this moment of self-negation in it. I'll now turn to Nishida's account of philosophical reflection, this is following up on Ueda's interpretation of Nishida's account of philosophical reflection. And Ueda offers this account in the context of interpreting Nishida's project in the inquiry in Zen no Kenkyu. So Nishida, I believe in the preface of the inquiry, he says, I want to explain everything on the basis of pure experience as the sole reality. Now, Ueda interprets this sentence, this statement, into three levels. There's a level of A, which is the fact of pure experience. This is the non-conceptual level. It's beyond words. It is merely the experience of pure experience. He also calls it the experience of awakening. Then there's this level B, which is already on the conceptual level. It is upon reflection, pure experience. The fact of pure experience itself develops itself. It articulates itself. And it says pure experience is the sole reality. And this is the level of jikaku, of self-awakening. But then there's another level, a higher order reflective level, where level B further expands itself and it says, I want to explain everything on the basis of pure experience as the sole reality. And Ueda says that at this level, what is happening is that we have both a self and a world understanding. So Ueda analyzes this statement into three levels. Now, philosophical reflection, which is what we're concerned with right now, is a higher order reflection that attempts to reveal the underlying basis of our knowledge and reality. So in this ABC level, philosophical reflection is at the level of C. Philosophical discourse happens at this level of C. And what's important for Nishida is that level C is the unfolding of levels A and B. So we can say that Nishida's philosophical reflection, I want to call this philosophical jikaku, and contrast that to a kind of simple jikaku, is a dynamic interplay of A, B, and C, these different levels. And philosophical discourse occurs at the level of C, but importantly, it is based on B and A, and ultimately based on the experience of awakening. That's what makes Nishida's philosophical reflection unique, that it's ultimately based on the experience of awakening on the non-conceptual level. Now what I want to do is to interpret this as a radicalized form of transcendental reflection. In order to do that, I have to give an account of what transcendental reflection is. I want to say that transcendental reflection is a second-order reflection that doesn't thematize objects to determine their real properties, but rather thematizes the conditions of possibility for our experience of objects. So transcendental reflection is different from, for example, psychological reflection or introspection, where it takes the mind as an object to determine the real properties of the mind. Transcendental reflection is a second-order reflection that is interested in the conditions of possibility for our experience of objects. So the question is Nishida dogmatically positing the non-reflective experience prior to the subject-object split, or is he philosophically reflecting on the conditions of possibility of our experience and pointing to the non-reflective experience prior to the subject-object split? To put it differently, no self, pure experience. Is this the transcendental ground of reality? And I think it is. So, Nishida's philosophical jikaku begins with the rupture of reflection, the experience of awakening. From here, he proceeds to reflect on the conditions of possibility for experience. Thus, I want to say that Nishida's philosophical jikaku is a kind of transcendental reflection, since it is a second-order reflection into the conditions of possibility for experience. Yet, it differs from traditional forms of transcendental reflection, since it ultimately reflects on the limits of reflection, whereby the subject-object dichotomy collapses and there simply is selfless experience. So in short, Nishida radicalizes transcendental reflection by taking it back to its pre-reflective origin in selfless experience. So to sum it up, first we have the experience of looking at the flower. Transcendental reflection, traditionally understood, reveals that transcendental subjectivity is the condition of possibility for such experience. So here we get the idea that no self, you don't have experience, no experience. But I want to say that Nishida radicalizes transcendental reflection, goes one step further, and in his philosophical jikaku, one becomes aware that absolute nothingness, or pure experience if you like, is a condition of possibility for such experience. So with this radicalized form of transcendental reflection, what is revealed is that no self, pure experience, you have reality as self, realizing itself. So here again, I want to point back to the initial statement that I made. What I think is the most enigmatic aspect of Nishida's philosophy is that he employs philosophical reflection to reveal the non-reflective experience prior to the subject-object split. So ultimately, through this radicalized transcendental reflection, he points us back to pure experience. No self, pure experience. And I want to, as a way of conclusion, point to Ueda's nice quote where he says, where I think nicely captures this unique aspect of Nishida's philosophical reflection. He says, Nishida was a Zen practitioner philosophizing and a philosopher practicing Zen. And I think ultimately that is how Nishida was able to reflect on this ultimate level of non-reflective selfless experience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have some time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Yuko, for a very clear presentation. Now, I have the impression, though, that Ueda is able to clarify Nishida by radically simplifying him and taking certain ambiguities and giving them a one-sided reading, which eliminates the other part of the ambiguity. So, for example, there is a deep ambiguity about the notion of reflection in Nishida. Sometimes, the word is ambiguous in English too. Sometimes it means what you're calling philosophical reflection, thinking back upon things, and sometimes it means optical reflection in mirrors. Nishida uses both, and in the language he uses hansei, and he uses tetsugakuteki. And he mixes those up. He does not distinguish clearly between those. So the kind of reflection Ueda is speaking about, and that you seem to be speaking about, pertains only to the hansei, the looking back upon, thinking back upon. Ueda also simplifies the ambiguity of the word jikaku, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean self-awakening in the Buddhist or Zen sense. It has lots of other meanings, even in Nishida. And he seems also to simplify the meaning of the notion of self. When he criticizes the notion, he's talking about a self created through reflection. But then there's also the true self that he talks about, which is somehow a selfless self. And I wonder if he doesn't also simplify what's being said about pure experience, because as I read it, Nishida doesn't claim that pure experience is selfless. He says that it is prior to the subject-object split. He says that it's prior to individuality, but I don't read him as saying that it's prior to any kind of self. Certainly, as Nishida developed, there's no experience without reflection, he talks about the self which reflects itself within itself. And he says experiencing and consciousness are inherently, intrinsically self-reflecting in the more optical sense of the term. So I do like very much your reading of early Nishida, at least, as a transcendental kind of hansei reflection. But I wonder if that really pertains only to Nishida before he developed his philosophy of jikaku.
Thank you. Definitely with Nishida's notion of reflection, there's this ambiguity between hansei and utsusu. But I think what I actually have in mind primarily is this more utsusu notion. So when I say that Nishida radicalizes transcendental reflection, I want to kind of say that it makes reflection into bashoteki jikaku, so topological or chorological or place-like reflection. And when we say that, when I wanted to say lastly that that absolute nothingness is a condition of possibility for such experience. So ultimately, absolute nothingness reflects itself within itself, right? So what kind of reflection is it here? Well, I want to still talk from the perspective of the I, kind of, but I want to say that here, in this kind of jikaku, we are fully disclosed to our place, and we find ourselves as a reflection of the place. So
that's a different sense than hansei.
Well, it is, but we in English too, we say, I think there's this ambiguity is kind of like intertwined. But I guess Nishida is pushing it. He's working with this notion of transcendental reflection, so hansei, but he's pushing it to want to include this notion of not hansei but utsusu, so place reflecting itself. And I guess with this notion of hansei, we still have this more like, it is my activity, right? But going towards a more deeper level, we realize that hansei is really a reflection of the place itself, of the absolute nothingness. So I do think that there is an ambiguity, but yeah, but I still have to think about how these two terms, kind of fit together.
Yes.
Thank you about the talk, and you mentioned these problem of seeing a flower. I think in Nishida, he mentioned that when he see a flower, in a certain sense, eye and the flower and the eye, or somehow they become together. Or he even used the notion of love, or bringing together. But I think Ueda, he tried to interpret in his book, Watashi to Ananda, that it's quite complicated. It's like watashi wa watashi nakushite watashi dear. Or in a certain sense, I'm seeing a flower, but I need to negate oneself to see the flower. So in this sense, I would say it is not necessarily simplifying Nishida's notion, but somehow Ueda tried to develop his own a rather dialectical way of seeing the flower in a kind of with the self, but at the same time without the self. But in this sense, it is not exactly a kind of transcendental way of seeing the flower. So this, how do you think about this Ueda's, I would say rather a dialectical way of seeing, and your proposal of a kind of a transcendental project of seeing the flower?
That's really a good point. I think first of all, Ueda does, like when he reads Nishida's formulation of jikaku, the self sees itself within the place, or within the self, right? This within, jiko wa jiko ni oite jiko miru. This within the self, and he says that, Ueda says that this formulation is somewhat unfortunate because it sounds like the self is enclosed within itself, right? So in a sense, he offers this alternative reading, namely that the self sees itself by being disclosed to one's place. And I think this notion of being disclosed is this moment of negation. The self must negate oneself and be open to one's place in order to see itself. And I think that's perhaps one of the uniqueness of Ueda, that he emphasized this moment of negation, which then leads to this more dialectical interplay between the place and the self, which I think Nishida later on, maybe in the 1930s, came to realize, but not so much in the 1920s. And actually, in my thesis, I focused on the 1920s, and I wanted to interpret Nishida as a transcendental philosopher then. But then once he starts developing this place-like Benshoho, the place-like dialectic, it's an open question whether you can really say that he's a transcendental philosopher. And I haven't really thought about whether Ueda's reading of Nishida also in some sense saves Nishida from falling into this transcendental trap. But it's something good to think about thinking.
If there's no question anymore, I think we can close the last session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.